Good morning. I'm William Martinson. I'm chairman of the Border Historical Society. I was requested to present a talk this morning on Theo Soga's Mission Church at Mgwali. And my presentation this morning will look at the church through the eyes of a heritage architect and a heritage practitioner. And this is part of my ongoing interest in documenting the built environment of the Eastern Cape. I first visited Mgwali on a return trip of the Border Historical Society's excursion to Mbulu Patterson Mission Station in the Transkei. Shortly thereafter, I was requested by an environmentalist who was doing a master's degree, MacDonald Mdluli, to prepare a drawing of Theo Soga's church. And the documentation process was duly completed, and this triggered some additional research. The outcome of the research was presented as an online lecture for the Soga Studies Conference in March 2022, and this talk today is an edited and extended version. At the outset, I must thank the Amatola Museum for some fine archived images of the church, all of which are acknowledged on the actual slides, and the recent color photographs and the video footage are all my own. So just to commence with a brief overview of the contents of my talk, I'll start with an introduction to Theo Soga and his family, give some context of the Mgwali mission station, some historical mapping of the site, some precedent for the temple front design of the mission church, an historical timeline of the mission church taken from Chalmers' biography of Theo Soga, then some recent photographs of the mission church and its various details. Then I'll present the measure drawing and its component parts, and then provide some suggested proportioning systems and regulating lines that might have been used by the original architect. And then the conclusion, a brief mention of the manse that is associated with this church, and then a lonely grave nearby at Mgwali. So Theo Soga can be briefly described as a minister, a missionary, a journalist, a translator, and a composer of hymns. He was born in 1829, schooled at the Chumi mission station under John Ross, and in 1844 went to Lovedale Missionary Institution near Alice. And in 1846 travelled to Scotland with Reverend William Govan. He attended the normal school in Glasgow and returned to South Africa, and in 1848 started the Uniondale Mission in Kaskamahook. Shortly thereafter, he returned to study in Scotland, and in 1856 was ordained in the United Presbyterian Church. In 1857, he married Janet Burnside in Scotland, and that year, Theo and Janet travelled back to South Africa, and in 1858, he founded the mission station at Mgwali among the Mnika. The Sogas would have 8 children, and I won't go through them in detail, but you will see from the list of professions that some of them entered that they were quite an illustrious set of children. And in 1867, the Soga family relocated to Tutuga Mission Station, and only a few years later, Theo Soga died of TB in August 1871. In 1903, Janet Soga died in Glasgow. So Mgwali Mission Station is located about halfway between East London and Queenstown, a short distance from the N6, and then midway between Hogsback in the Amatola Mountains and Butterworth in the Transkei. As an aside, the clear horizontal line, I don't know if you can see that running through there, that is an interesting geological feature known as the Transkei Gap, and it is presumed that this probably introduced by a vertical dike of an easily weathering rock, which intruded into the sedimentary rocks of the district and weathered over thousands of years to produce this unusual feature. A more detailed extract shows Mgwali on the road from Stutterheim to Tsomo, and the convoluted outline of the Kai River is clearly visible over there. So obviously this is the Transkei, and this is what was British Kaffraria or South Africa. The western end of the Transkei Gap is clearly visible in the middle right-hand side of the photograph. And if we move to a contemporary, an early military map of 1853, prepared by Mitchell and Jevois, of the same area, you can see that this area was then described as the new Gaika location. And the map recorded 3 German mission stations on the periphery, underlined in red, And it also identified two abandoned British forts underlined in green along the wagon road to the wagon drift over the Kai. So the wagon road was running along up to where you see wagon drift. So there's Fort Worden and there's Fort Wellington, and this is the wagon road. So just to give you some context, the N2 currently crosses the Kai River at a point roughly there. So for many years, this was the only accessible crossing in the early days of this era. So the settlement of Ngwali is shown on this Google Earth extract, with the mission church highlighted and the three separate villages that are currently there, clearly visible. There's one there, there, and there. And if I zoom in slightly, it shows the relative positions of the mission church, the old school, which is now the museum, and the manse. This is a later recent school building, and the balance of the mission site is here. And sadly, all of the corrugated iron roofs have recently been removed. They were all derelicts, but they now are not going to survive for much longer. So the Surveyor General's Office has an archived survey drawing of the Ngwali allotment area in the Ngwali Reserve dated October 1880. And it locates the mission station in relation to three linear groupings of rectangular building lots. So it's maybe not too clear, but this is made up, each of these blocks is made up of maybe 40 separate rectangular building blocks. So you were permitted to build a house in these areas. And then the larger sort of irregular lots were allocated as garden lots, and they typically follow the river's edge. And what is also interesting is that the names of the registered grantees are all recorded down the side of the page, and it makes for potentially very useful data for social historians looking into this mission station. Then if we zoom in on that particular drawing, the survey drawing clearly recorded the site of the mission grant, which is obviously this sort of area, and it picks up the position of the church, the school, which then was an L-shaped plan. You'll see from photographs that it is now only a rectangular building. It's that wing of the building. It shows the parsonage or the manse and then a small shop, but importantly it shows the wagon road quite far removed to the south of those buildings. So Google Earth Pro has a useful feature that allows you to insert a soft copy of a drawing over the aerial photograph. And I then inserted that same drawing and overlaid it with some transparency applied, and with some manipulation, an almost exact correspondence is achieved. And it's quite clear from this that these original areas of building lots have in each case expanded considerably to form larger villages. But what is also interesting is that the garden lots are currently almost non-existent or not very productive. Okay, and then taking that more detailed extract, you can see how the current road, which passes just to the south of the church and the school, has been relocated. So clearly a more modern engineering design looked at a more appropriate routing and relocated it slightly to the north. Joseph Newey's map of the Gaika location of 1889 records the overall extent of the Ngwali Reserve, which is this big piece of land running up like that, but it also shows the extent of that mission grant. And what is also interesting about this drawing is that it's now recording the subdivision of this large piece of land, or the entire district, in fact, into identified farms. So these were then allocated to white farmers. A more modern surveyor general diagram captures in a much more clinical way the exact cadastral outlines of the two urban, and that's the urban 1914 is the church, and the school or museum building is on 1915. Looking at the architectural features of the Ngwali Mission Church, the west facade of the church, which is pictured here, is noteworthy for the use of what is known as a blind tetrastyle temple front. The word tetrastyle means 4 columns in Greek, and you'll see that that's the column, there's another one hidden behind there, and that's the 4th one. And it's not really a column in this case, it's actually a pilaster because it's attached to the building, and that's why it's known as a blind tetrastyle temple front. So it has, the temple front is formed with this triangular pediment. That's the particular feature of that. and then the 4 pilasters applied to the facade, as opposed to using 4 freestanding columns, which you might be more familiar with. So there were certainly many precedents for such a tetrastyle facade, both from ancient Roman examples and from more recent neoclassical buildings, such as these 2 examples, which were published in English pattern books of the early 1800s. Then closer home in Grahamstown, the Baptist Church of 1842 used an interesting variant of the blind tetrastyle portico. In this case, you can see the pilasters, the central pilasters were doubled up to cope with this slightly enlarged projected central portion, and then it had a central arched entrance door. Then the Mission Church I'm dating it circa 1888, and this particular engraving was on the front cover of the Dutch translation of Chalmers' biography of Tiyosoga, which was published circa 1888. And what it does confirm for me, because this is the earliest image that I've managed to locate of the church, it confirms that this entrance porch was almost certainly an original feature of the original church, and it also confirms that little lean-to extension was also certainly original. So just looking at an abbreviated timeline of this church building, and these are extracted from a book titled Tiyosoga, A Page of South African Mission Work by John A. Chalmers, published in 1877. And he was Soga's missionary colleague, and the book was substantially based on reports and letters that Soga had sent back to Scotland, having to report to his mother Waddy. So an accurate timeline of the process could easily be determined. So Chalmers provides the first reference to the proposed church from an entry dated September 1859. And if I read it, our first little church, constructed to contain 200 people, was lately enlarged in order to accommodate 50 or 60 more, and still it is too small. It became evident to Tiyosoga, therefore, that he must either cease inviting his countrymen to come to church on Sundays from want of space, or that he must have a larger and more commodious building. The latter alternative he chose. And this is a photograph of Tiyosoga from the Mission of the United Presbyterian Church, published in 1896. By 7th of March 1860, a public meeting was held at Mgwali, and I again read, I resolved to get the people to do something towards the furtherance of the object. Accordingly, a public meeting was held, at which the Reverend Richard Ross of Lovedale and Mr. Charles Brownlee were present, and rendered most signal service by the able advocacy of our cause. Continuing at that meeting, the object of the meeting was to commence a system of monthly subscriptions towards the erection of a more commodious place of worship. The result was not very gratifying, as after much pressure, the sum collected only amounted to £13. So April 1860, Soga visited Grahamstown, and his object was to raise a building which would cost £500, of which he desired to collect the sum of £150 by his own efforts, and then appeal to the church at home for the rest. I preached in Trinity Church, therefore, on the second Sabbath of April last, morning and evening, and addressed the Sabbath schools in the afternoon. The results of my efforts in Grahamstown, including collections and subscriptions, amounted to £118, 10 shillings. So what is also interesting is notice the tetrastyle facade of the Trinity Church in which he was to do that preaching. April 1860, he visited Port Elizabeth. So he proceeded from Grahamstown to Port Elizabeth, and the young people of the Sabbath school displayed a most gratifying interest in the cause of Christ. When I entered, many of them started to their feet and stretched out their little hands towards me with pennies, threepences, sixpences, and shillings, saying as they did so, "This is to buy bricks for your church." The whole amount I have succeeded in raising for our proposed church is £362. In March 1861, he then considered the design of the mission church, and it is recorded in Chalmers that the plan for a church was given by an officer in King Williamstown. The church is to be 65 feet long by 35 feet wide, and converted to decimal is 19,812 millimeters by 10,668. So it is my suggestion that the officer referred to was almost certainly a Royal Engineer stationed in King Williamstown, Architecture had been introduced in their training in 1825, and by the 1840s, the Royal Engineers in South Africa were contributing a large body of primarily military buildings and structures. The two imprints of the Royal Engineers shown here were copied from a book that was originally in the Royal Engineers Library in Cape Town, and the structure within the imprint is a Martello tower, similar to that built at Fort Beaufort. And the Latin motto that you can see below that Martello tower is ubique, which means everywhere. March 1861, he started procuring materials, and they record that the quarrying of stones and the making of bricks, the sawing of timber, and the employment of workmen, all the numerous worrying elements preparatory to the commencement of a building, were now experienced by Tiyo Soga. And on the 9th of March 1861, he recorded the commencement. The builder this day dug the foundations of our future church. In the course of a few days, the foundation stone will be laid. A couple of months went by before the laying of the foundation stone, and this was laid by the Geiger Commissioner, Charles Brownlee Esquire, on the 23rd of May, 1861. And at that ceremony, Soga read out two inscriptions in English and in Xhosa, containing a historical reference to the laying of the foundation stone. The sheet in English contained a list of the names of our 8 office bearers, the 95 church members, and 30 catechumens. The sheet in Xhosa had a copy of the prayer which I offered up on the occasion. These documents, with current coins which were collected by the people on the spot, were placed in a small leaden box which was deposited in the stone underlaying the foundation stone. So the opening ceremony was then held on Sunday, 15 June 1862. The church for which Tiyo Soga had traveled so much and pled so eloquently was open for the public worship of God. The preachers on the occasion were all remarkable men in the Xhosa mission field. They included Reverend John Brownlee from King Williamstown, Reverend William Govan of Lovedale, Reverend Bryce Ross of Pirrie, and Reverend James Reed of Phillipton. And then there was a public meeting held on the 18th of June, presided over by the Geiger Commissioner, and the report read on the occasion showed that the church cost £1,464, 14 shillings and 6 and that the money collected amounted to £1,113, 2 shillings and 2 of which Tiyo Soga had raised by his own efforts £600. And there remained upon the building a debt of £350. The Mgwali church then is completed. It has the reputation of being the most commodious and substantial and the neatest Xhosa church in British Kafreri. So the concluding remarks by Chalmers, he notes that the building itself is an unpretentious building and possesses no architectural beauty or ornamentation. The one merit of the church is its commodiousness. It has nothing of the dim religious light. He's obviously referring to the light quality of an English church. Has nothing of the dim religious light of an ecclesiastical building. The flood of sunshine which pours in by its large windows seems too great for a land in which it seems always afternoon. The Mgwali church, which, as long as it stands, will remain a monument not of the architectural skill, but of the unwearied self-sacrifice of Tiyo Soga, its first minister. When it crumbles into dust, his earnest, pious soul will still continue to reap the reward of his willing offering. So I would certainly contradict Chalmers' remarks that the building possesses no architectural beauty. It certainly has very fine proportions and an elegant simplicity. And clearly Chalmers was comparing Soga's church to more substantial and better funded churches. So then looking at photographs of the building as it stands today, this is the west elevation, and note particularly the bullseye ventilator. So that happens on both sides of the gables. It is obviously ventilating the roof space. The 2 arched blind windows, which is really just an architectural device to elaborate the 2 walls between the pilasters, the triangular pediment and the 4 pilasters forming the tetrastyle temple front, the red painted stone plinth, and then the steps on either side of the entrance. There's a door on this side and a door on that side. The commemorative tablet was installed on a face brick plinth circa 2007 to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the church. And the tablet lists the names of the ministers who worked at the Mgwali mission over this period. And the one name, which, apart from Tio Soga's name, this name of Reverend Holsworth Mama has reference to something which I'll show you just now. Looking at the actual details, this is obviously a capital of one of the pilasters, and it shows the sharply defined classical moldings used and how well these read in the strong South African sunlight and how they cast shadows and create a very distinct line. A composite view of one of the triangular pediments with applied string course shadow lines. So the string course would be that thing, and then these are shadow lines that are created by that plaster band. The molded capitals and the louvered bullseye ventilator. Looking at an oblique view from the northwest, clearly shows the attached entrance hall with one of the arched entrance doors, the projecting plinth, the arched windows and arched entrance. The use of horizontal plaster bands which articulate the lines of the facade. So again, those plaster bands continue down just below the pattern line. And then what is also noteworthy is how that end pilaster is repeated in a slightly narrower pilaster on this facade, but you don't see it happening down there. Then an oblique view from the southwest, very similar detailing and view to the previous one. Then, unfortunately, there is no formal foundation stone with an inscription. And this is the detail of the one corner pilaster, and you can see that it's made of large dressed stone blocks. They've actually been squared off. There's one, there's another one. And it's more than likely that it is one of these blocks that was the actual foundation stone. And it's also my suggestion that this, what would be called a plaster fillet, it was probably a more detailed, classically inspired base, and that at some stage it was restored by the simple expedient of creating a sloping surface. A portion of missing plaster confirms that the wall is built of fired clay bricks, probably laid in English bond. It's not clear unless the bigger area was open, but it's more than likely in that bond. And on the right-hand side, partially hidden by the side pilaster, is the end restraints of a tension tie bar. And what very often happens in these early buildings is that the external walls start moving outwards, and to try and restrict that movement, various steel tie bars are inserted through the entire building, and they're anchored by that means. The detail of the plinth shows that it's just hammer-dressed local stone, and it's not clear whether it was originally plastered or this is a later plaster, I'm not sure. One of the air bricks that provides ventilation to the subfloor space, quite possibly this sort of punched metal sheet replaced what was originally possibly a more ornate cast iron air brick. Then the view from the northeast, note how the vestry leaned to. So this is the vestry in that space, but notice how the vestry is carefully set back from that corner of the church facade, so that that line is not lost by two planar faces meeting. And then if I show you how the windows have changed, this is a bit deceptive because this is a very much an oblique view, so it's sort of compressing the window. But can you see that originally it was a timber sliding sash window with a arched window fan light with these sort of lancet-shaped transoms. And then on the left-hand side, that window opening has been replaced with a steel window of a similar dimension. So fortunately, because very often these are replaced with windows that don't bear any relation to the original size of the window, it has been respected the original opening. And then again, notice that one of those steel tension bar endings. A view from the southwest, and it is my suggestion that this projecting extension was probably built later because there's no concern for maintaining a step back there. And then this is a typical detail that you'll see around this part of the world, where the wall is taken up to form a parapet and the corrugated iron is just built into the wall. So I would suggest it's probably an addition from maybe the 1960s or 70s, but I don't know. The windows in the south facade were, however, reduced in height, probably as a cost-saving measure. And you can see that the original height of the window is still clearly visible with the memory of that crack in the plaster. Unfortunately, the building is deteriorating. The gutters have fallen off or have been removed, and the timber fascias are starting to fall off. Now, approaching into the entrance of the building, this is a view on the left-hand side taken from within that entrance hall. And you can see that the door is a fine double inward opening door with heavy fielded panels and these collection moldings around them, and that interesting arched fanlight. And then also note the matched lining board ceiling treated with shellac in that space. Then passing into the church itself, looking to the right, this is one of a pair of steeply raked timber choir stalls that are constructed on either side of the entrance door. That's a memory of the COVID restrictions when I visited the church. It was still under those restrictions. And then the arched windows were articulated on the interior with what is called an arched hood mold, which is, you'll see in the next slide, has a particular profile to it, which would have been made in place by a skilled plasterer. And you can see that the entrance door similarly has that arched hood mold. Then looking at the tension tie bar, and if you look at the manner in which it is made, and it's clearly fabricated by a blacksmith from this probably 20mm round bar, and it's carefully beaten into that shape to interlock and permit the much longer piece of metal that was required. Standing on one of those choir stalls looking towards the altar end at the east end of the church, you can see that the entire wall has now been clad with colorful cloth drapes, as has the low balustrade to what is a later raised platform across that entire width of the church. Fortunately, the Amatola Museum has a photograph taken circa 1980 showing that same back wall. And what's interesting is there is an interesting painted text there. There's a commemorative tablet there, a commemorative tablet there. And you can also notice the horizontal tie bar only across there, and that's the junction. And fortunately, that big fabric screen just covered all of this. And so it's a painted Xhosa inscription. It's fortunately still extant, and it reads Mbongeni uYehova nomkeziwe, which translated as "Bless the Lord, all ye nations," and comes from Psalm 117. And if you look at the detail of that painting, done in very beautiful hand-painted letters, and hopefully it will survive any later painting over of the interior. Then the big plaque to the right is a commemorative plaque dedicated to Reverend Theo Soga with a Xhosa inscription I'm dating it circa 1871. And the following is the English rendering of the inscription written by Reverend Dr. William Anderson. This stone is to keep us in remembrance of the Reverend Theo Soga, the first ordained preacher of the Xhosa race. He was a friend of God, the lover of his son, inspired by his spirit, discipline of his holy word, an ardent patriot, a large-hearted philanthropist, a dutiful son, an affectionate brother, a tender husband, a loving father, a faithful friend, a learned scholar, an eloquent orator, and in manners a gentleman, a devoted missionary who spent himself in his master's service, a model Xhosa. So where I've put those words in Xhosa, bear in mind this publication or this thing was done many years ago, and it is inappropriate language in the original, which I've just replaced it with Xhosa. So looking at the detail of that stone, you can see it's been very beautifully cut. These are called V-cut letters, cut in a block of, I think it's probably a fine-grained sandstone, and it has this very beautifully observed rope frame carved in stone. And looking at the bottom right-hand corner, it records the sculptor's name, J.M. McFarlane of Dundee, Scotland. And also what is worth noticing is the very fine detailing. Typically in these sorts of tablets, the stonemason would create a 45-degree chamfered edge around the frame, but then when he needed to return back to a square edge, he created a stop chamfer, and that one is done like that, and then this stop chamfer is done like that. So done with a great deal of care and attention to detail. On the other side of that door is a second plaque, and I'm assuming, I don't know for the fact, but it's recording Agnes Maria Mama, and I'm assuming that, and the two other people, which are presumably related to her, but I'm presuming that Agnes Maria Mama was the wife of Reverend Holsword Mama, but that's just my suggestion. And the English translation of that inscription reads, "Memorial to the passing of Agnes Maria Mama, who was born in 1874 and passed away in 1936, a teacher, and her daughter, Fikizwa Miranda, 1914 to 35, the grandchild, Agnes Maria Kalule, 1936, a woman who was an exemplary person of virtue, the congregation and church attest." Then you might have noticed to the right of that painted logo on the wall was a small circular plaque. And that was issued to mark the Sanlam Restoration Award in 2001. I did have a look online, but I found nothing online about the award, and the details remain to be established. But presumably the restoration must have happened prior to that, and it received an award for it. This is the interior of that vestry space, just a simple rectangular space with a match lining board ceiling. Then looking at the old school, which is now the museum building, and that L-shaped wing would have originally come out on this side. And it is, if one ever intends to go and visit this site and you are able to gain access to the museum, it has quite an interesting selection of old photographs, but this is just a view taken up into the roof space. I'm assuming that this thatch is just a sort of some form of insulation, because it wouldn't have worked as a thatch roof at this low pitch. So I suspect this is part of the restoration. Then looking at the church bell, this is a reinforced concrete construction, and if one is there and you look at, if you're able to see the detail of this, you can quite clearly see the marks of the formwork. But I'm quite sure that it probably replaced a timber structure like that still extant at the Piri mission station and at other mission stations. And just to give you an idea of the sort of extensive landscape views that you get out from the church, this is taken from roughly in front of the west end of the church, looking out to the north towards the Transkei. That's just a detail of the bell and the clapper. You can see those lines of the concrete, the memory of that timber shuttering that was used to form that. Unfortunately, many of these bells have descriptive text cast in with a date and a maker's name, but this one has nothing. Then I was there one morning and the man came to ring the bell. I think it was at 8 o'clock. And I thought it was just nice to show you, give you some sort of the flavor of the congregation being called to worship on a Sunday morning in this remote part of the world. So then the measure drawing that I compiled in 2021, and it isn't a comprehensive measure drawing, it's really a preliminary drawing, but it does capture the essence of the building, and most particularly the plan of the church, 2 elevations, a site plan and a section, as well as the details of the bell structure. And if you look at the plan itself, you should note particularly that small entrance hall, which is over there. That's the main entrance door that I showed the details of. The 2 stepped, what I've called choir stalls. If you notice these dotted lines, those are the lines of a tension tie bar that is holding the 2 lateral walls together. The later raised floor at the west end is this. It's got 2 steps up, and the reason that one knows that it is later is that you then step down within the door itself. So someone of my height can't walk through there without ducking down. And then the vestry on what I'm assuming was the original vestry is that structure, and then this later structure. And there's that flush junction versus the step junction in the original. The elevations and section drawings and access was not possible into the roof space, and the roof structure that I've shown here is really just notional, but there's almost certainly some sort of complex roof truss in there. The bell tower with the tapered legs and the arched crossing, and the site plan, which I traced from Google Earth. Mm-hmm. And then what I was interested in is that very often these sorts of early neoclassical buildings were governed by careful proportioning and careful regulating lines. And so just to give you an introduction into what I mean by this is that a regulating line would govern the proportioning and sizing of plans, sections, and elevations. This particular analytical drawing is an example of the proportioning of a doorway suggested in Serlio's architectural treatise of 1537, so quite early. So he would, if he was proposing to another architect how to set up the proportions of a door, he would start off with this square, perfect square. He would subdivide it in with the diagonals, and then taking the midpoint of that line, create another set of 2 lines. So the diagonal lines and the other 2 cross-cutting lines will give you the width of the door and the place and points of the ornaments of the same door. So immediately just by the manner in which that's done, it's created a visually appealing proportion, which is so often lacking in modern architecture in East London. Then another example, those of you who know neoclassical buildings will know that this is the Pantheon, a classical building in Rome with the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. And squares, rectangles, and their diagonals were applied by this architect Blondel over a drawing of the existing classical building to try and understand the proportion and likely regulating lines. And you can see that there are a whole lot of significant intersections relating to the positions of items on this. So clearly it's his best guess at what might have governed the proportioning, but very often it's likely to have been like that. And also bear in mind that these original architects would have had very limited drawing equipment, perhaps a straight edge, a square, and a compass or a set of dividers. So it's not like today when you have CAD graphics and you just set up something without any real thought as to what it might look like. So then I decided to take these drawings that I'd prepared and try and understand and assess how the design of this facade might have been regulated. The results presented here are the final versions of numerous iterations that I did. So in this particular example, I took a square of ABCD, and I chose to take it on the inner face of the external pilasters, and that then subdivided vertically and horizontally gave a line across the drawing which picked up the top edge of those pilasters. So that was an interesting coincidence, or was intentional, I don't know. Then if you take a 30-60 degree angle, you'll notice that then picks up close to the height of the upper portion of that external pilaster. And then if one took a equilateral triangle applied on the facade, it also picked up some significant points. Likewise, these sort of intersections pick up those. So it's my best guess at what might have governed this facade. I can't say it is like that or was like that, but it seems fairly likely. Looking at the section drawing, the same square applied over the section. So I'm now taking it on the inner face of those external walls and from the floor upwards. And you'll see that while it's not exactly successful here, the midpoint of the square is very close to the height of the ceiling. That's the ceiling height, and there's the. So what you'll notice is that space comprises two subsquares. And certainly when you're standing within that church, it has a very pleasing feeling, a three-dimensional space that you're experiencing. Another facade exploration was made using the golden mean, and you might be familiar with it. It's the ratio of 1 to 1.618. And again, if you took the square of ABCD, so it's taking a square, so from the center line of the building, ABCD, and then find the midpoint of the one face, and then you take that EB and you rotate it up to there, and you end up it's whether it's coincidental or not, it reaches the top of that pediment, and therefore creates that relationship of 1 to 1.618. Then I started looking at the plan, considering how could the plan have been regulated. And I tested it with a variety of proportioning systems, and I plugged in a square at the one end and put a circle through it and the two crosses, and then I put a square at the other end and did the same thing, but it didn't seem to bear any relationship to anything. So that was one that I discarded. I then looked at the plan using a golden mean rectangle, again the proportion 1 to 1.618, and I plugged in a square at the one end. I took the halfway mark of that square up to B and then struck it down, and it reached this point, and it seemed to coincide slightly to this platform, but knowing that that platform was a later insertion which had nothing to do with the original architect, it seemed unlikely to have any relationship, so I discarded that. I then looked at, you're probably all familiar with the proportioning, the proportioning that governs the A series of paper. If you take a single square, so I inserted that square to take the diagonal and use that diagonal to strike an arc. The proportions of that, which is 1 to the square root of 2, is the exact proportion of the A series of papers. But again, it didn't seem to make any sense. So then I had a brainwave and I placed the square in the middle of the plan. And I did the same proportion of the 1 to the square root of 2 running down to there, and it coincided and it ran down to there. So whether that is what governed it, I don't know, but certainly if I was a military engineer sitting in King Williamstown's limited equipment, maybe that was what governed the length by the breadth, I don't know. So just looking at the heritage significance of this building, the church has a substantial heritage significance in my view. It clearly has a direct association with Te Soga, with the Presbyterian Church in South Africa and in Scotland. It's an early example of an intact mission church. It is a declared provincial heritage site. It's a landmark in the area, and most importantly, it continues to be used as a church, and certainly it is worth conserving for the future. And then just briefly in passing, the manse that was constructed to accommodate Te Soga was a fine counterpoint to the church and of a similar age. It's what is known as a Stoepkamer house, where these two projecting wings on either side of this extensive veranda both had doors into it, so that visitors to the family didn't have access into the interior of the house, but they could be accommodated in a separate room. And then that building survived pretty much intact in this form. This was one of these Amatola Museum collection photographs from circa 2005. And in 2020, the building prior to this had been used as a creche, and it was then vacated. And someone noticed that there was a beehive in the chimney, and they climbed up into the roof, smoked the bees out, and in doing so caused the roof to catch alight, and it was burnt out. This is all that remains of it today. The building is a declared and in the old South Africa it was known as a declared national monument. It's now a provincial heritage site. As you can see, there's absolutely nothing has been done to it. That's a view taken within the central passage of the house, looking out to the sort of extensive landscape to the south. Those are the last two original inward opening timber windows that remain in the house. And clearly it would require a body like ECPRA or DESRAC to motivate for expenditure to restore it. But I would hope that it can be done. We did measure it up in detail on a recent visit, so I have the necessary documentation to construct a drawing of it. And then in closing, just to show you a lonely grave at Mgwali, and it's the grave of Eliza Jane Chalmers, and she was the wife of John Chalmers, who wrote the biography and from which I was quoting so extensively. And quite sad that she was only 23 years old when she died. And this is her grave in the small graveyard just to the south of the church. And with that, thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions on the presentation. Yeah.
Actually, exactly where it is. So I gathered just south of Stadthaven. Is it?
Just to the
The north.
northeast of Stadthaven. If you're driving up from Stadthaven and you get to the top of that, or halfway up that hill, there's a turn off to the right. I think it says to Tsomo Bolo. It might even say Mgwali, but I don't think so. There's a railway station as you've turned right, you'll pass an old defunct railway station. But it is on, if you search for it on Google Earth, you'll find it.
How far from the main road, from the tar road?
Must be about 20 kilometers, I would think, 25. When I last went, it was a reasonable road, recently been graded. If one does decide to go there, you might be lucky and find someone who could open it for you. But if you go on a Sunday morning, you'll probably have a better chance of getting in. That's a good question. I don't know, but I would think 400 or 500, but I don't know. That's something I need to find out.
Because it was originally 200.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I would think about 400. Yeah.
And was it normal to have a storms? Because it's the summer.
Maybe that wasn't a choir stall, and maybe it was just an extra accommodation, but I don't know. I was just speculating. I didn't ask them. It was just my view, but you might be right that the choir wasn't there.
Because was it done more on the European churches, the Scottish churches thing?
Well, it's an east-west orientation.
The inside side, was it done on?
It's really just a big rectangular space. So it doesn't have, in a typical European church, there would be the nave and then the various sub-parts. But this is just one big space with a vestry attached to the one end and the entrance hall. But, whether it will survive going into the future is anyone's guess, because they obviously have limited congregations and limited funds. So, over the few years that I've been visiting it, it's certainly starting to deteriorate. And the minute the rainwater is not controlled and just runs down the walls, you start getting major problems, and then you'll get wild figs will start taking root. Yeah. So it is a problem, and I suspect without external assistance, these things are not. It might follow what Chalmers was saying about turning to dust one day. It'd be very sad. The main thing is it's now been documented. Yes.
Did you happen to investigate the relationship between the building and the community? Do they have any particular aids towards the disruptions that you mentioned?
I didn't. Unfortunately, or regrettably, I can't speak Xhosa, so one is always has a bit of a disadvantage. But I'm afraid I didn't. I was more interested in the architecture, and obviously those inscriptions and plaques were clearly of interest. But it probably would take someone to go there and interview some of the older congregants and take some oral histories. I'm sure it might be very interesting. Yeah.
Can I just say what I know about the story is the fact that he's collected the money, he raised the money, he built his church with his congregation and the help of the people around there. And to me, this is a very unique thing in South Africa today.
Yeah, that's very, very good
I
point.
love the story. I've read the second
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for fascinating talk. I think your research is a very important document of Eastern or some of Eastern Cape history. I also think it calls for a visit to Mbali and perhaps get some of the community to meet with the group who goes for a visit.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something to consider. But thank you very much again, and thanks for participating at the Artists Festival. Thank you.
Pleasure.